Hi, I'm Scott the Miniature Maniac, and today we're going to discuss how and where to place highlights and shadows on almost all of your miniatures. What up, Mini family? A question that occurs endlessly on the internet is, where do I put my highlights and my shadows? And in fact, the first piece of advice that I give to an intermediate painter who's asking for feedback is about highlight and shadow placement. There's more to highlight and shadow placement than riding that crispy edge all the way into the sunset. So, what's the trick? The first thing we need to establish is where our main source of light is coming from for our miniature. In 95% of all our miniature scenes, it's coming from above, and that's probably because of the sun, but you can choose to do something different if it serves your idea better. When choosing where your main lights or lights are in a scene, mess around and see what works best for what you're trying to pull off. Is the scene a hard light casting really defined shadows, or is it a softer, bigger source that's more diffused? These are things you need to think about when you're establishing the feel of your paint job. If you don't know where to start with a cloudy day with the sun at its peak. That's what most paint jobs are based around. Okay, so you got your miniature, you have your chosen light source or sources. Now what? Well, let's analyze the scene a little bit. So it's a cloudy day, which means that virtually the entire sky is a light source. So how does that affect our highlight placement? It would look sort of strange to illuminate our entire character top to bottom like this. He is composed of many different shapes, and each shape needs to be treated especially. Okay, so what if we take each individual piece of our character and highlight it top to bottom? Closer, but not exactly correct. So what's the trick? Let's take a look at an individual ray of light. Where your highlight placement should be strongest is where the light ray and the surface in question are perpendicular, where they form a 90-degree angle. The closer to parallel we get, the darker that part of the model should be. One difference I want to draw your attention to between the second and third image is that the area on the forehead and the bridge of the nose and also the chest received additional highlights. And why is that? This quite literally illustrates the difference between a 2D image and also a 3D object. This Marine's forehead and bridge of his nose and also his abdomen area reach out toward us in Z space. If you were to rotate this image 90 degrees, you would see that those areas were sticking out. The highlight areas also mimic the shape of the Marine. The highlights on the head are more circular, as they are also on the chest and abdomen region. Highlighting objects in this way allows painters to give shape to each individual part of the miniature and allows it to not look so flat as highlighting it top to bottom. This piece of advice is from a book I picked up called Figopedia by Jeremy Bonamont. Some common sense should be used as well. There are parts of the figure like the underside of the arm or the underside of the waist and leg region that will be completely obscured from light, but they shouldn't be entirely dark. Certain items in the scenery or on the model itself will reflect light into those areas and they'll be illuminated a little bit. If you're struggling with visualizing the light, reducing each part of the model to a basic shape can help, provided you know what each shape looks like given the same main light source in your scene. Keeping a reference nearby of these basic shapes while you're painting can help in the beginning. Alright, Mr. Internet Man, you've sure talked a lot about angles and light rays, but can you actually pull this off? Well, I'm glad you asked. There are two ways that I approach this type of methodology. One with an airbrush and two with a paintbrush. Let's start with the airbrush. First, we'll base coat the miniature. Then we'll apply our highlight, but only from the direction where the light rays would be coming from. So in this case, top down. It's like the beam of paint is emulating where the light would fall. I'll slowly increase the brightness while slowly applying less and less paint. You can also add slightly more dilution as you progress and lower the pressure to target smaller and smaller areas and make very subtle changes. If you're curious about the relationship between airbrush pressure and also the dilution of the paint inside the airbrush, check out the video in the top right hand corner of the screen. Another thing I often do because I'm lazy is I don't fully clean out the pot when I'm transitioning colors. This minimal mixing allows for a better blend, or at least I tell myself that to justify my laziness. Once we get to our desired brightness, you can see the effect when you tip the model down towards the bottom. As it rotates, the color gets darker and darker. This technique works especially great on models with very organic shapes with very subtle bends and curves. But not everyone has an airbrush, and some people just kind of flat out hate them.
Airbrushing takes zero skill.
You can do the same thing with a brush, and it also has its advantages. The first thing I'm going to do after base coating is block in my shadows. I'm thinking about that rule I mentioned earlier. Where my light rays form a perpendicular with the surface I'm painting is where the light is strongest. I'm not doing much, if any, blending at this stage. I then do the same thing with brighter colors, mixing in a yellowy off-white tone into my rich brown color and doing several layers of rough highlights. Now comes the magical step. I'm going to do a mixture of wet blending and feathering. And feathering is essentially wet blending, but instead of using a second color, I'm going to only use water to ease the transition between my layers of color. This is the most time-consuming step in the process and one you could skip by using more layers of intermediate color. If you use enough layers, you don't need to blend at all. As soon as you're 10 inches away from the model or so, the blend will look seamless. I've said this in the past and I'm going to say it again now. You will try this process for the first 30 minutes and it will look terrible. Keep working at it for an hour or 2 hours and then set it down and come back to it the next day. Give yourself the opportunity to fail and improve slowly. Patience is key. The main benefit of a brush over an airbrush in this circumstance is that when I make a mistake with these colors, I have them right on my palette in front of me to fix those mistakes. When I'm airbrushing, I'm creating very seamless blends due to how transparently and how smoothly an airbrush can apply paint. If and when I mess up and cause some paint to spiderweb or I want to change it, it's very hard to do so with an airbrush. So you resort to your brush and it can be very difficult to get those exact same colors. So you often end up with patches of paint where you clearly use the brush to fix a mistake you made with your airbrush. Paintbrushes are also nice because I can get a very large amount of contrast over a small area. My shadow tone is a very deep navy blue. My midtone is a very rich, warm brown color, and I can work that transition in a very small area. With an airbrush, sometimes it can be hard to get into those small areas to get that same contrast swing. This, of course, could also be because I'm not very good with an airbrush yet. Speaking of people that are pretty good with an airbrush, let's shout out some patrons. This week we're giving some love to Mellow Link, Mike Driscoll, Adam Bush, Stefan Podol, the tacos are here, Scott McDougall, James Onion, Gian Finlayson, Alfredo Ramirez, Dalton Nielsen, DJ Doot, and Carlos Rosas. Thank you guys for your generosity and thinking that the stuff that I make on YouTube is worth your money. Patreon is my largest form of consistent payment on YouTube and my biggest way to potentially doing this at some point full time. So I really appreciate your guys' support and your guys' belief in me that I can deliver interesting and entertaining content. It really does mean a lot. If you guys are interested in my Patreon and the rewards that I have for my Patreon, you can find a link to it in the description below. But in the title of the video and also in the intro, I said this technique can apply to almost everything. So what doesn't it exactly apply to? Well, some materials scatters light and some materials reflect light, and there are also ones that are in between. Ones that scatter light a lot are things like cloth or felt or stone, and items that reflect light a lot are things like mirrors or glass or metal. And the items that scatter a lot of light, this technique can be used for pretty safely. But for items that reflect light, you need to consider what I spoke about in my non-metallic metal video in the first half of the video, which you can find linked in the top right-hand corner of the video. Remember that the amount that a material will reflect light and scatter light is on a gradient. It's not black and white, and you as the miniature painter get to decide for each material on your model how much it is going to reflect light and how much it's going to scatter light. This is my end result. I hope this basic idea can help you understand how to highlight and shade your miniatures with whatever tool you decide to use, not needing to rely upon washing or edge highlighting all the time. If you enjoyed this video and also the advanced nature of the topic, I have a YouTube playlist with a bunch of other advanced miniature painting techniques that you can find in the top right hand corner of the screen. If you want to support the channel, I have a Patreon account with a bunch of fun rewards and a merchandise store, both things linked below. Subscribe or die!
And most importantly, don't forget to paint more minis!